Welcome to this new episode brought to you by Volta 15. Across history, punishment has taken many forms, but some were designed not just to wound the body, but to wound the spirit. From the medieval stocks and scarlet letters to modern public shamings that live forever online, humiliation has long been used as a weapon of justice. In this countdown, we'll uncover 15 of the most publicly humiliating punishments the world has ever seen. Let's begin the list. Number 15. The stocks. The stocks were a familiar sight across medieval Europe and colonial America. Constructed of heavy wooden beams with holes cut to secure a person's ankles and sometimes wrists, they left the offender helpless in a public square, fully exposed to whatever the crowd had in mind. Originally intended for petty crimes like theft, drunkenness, or disorderly behavior, the punishment quickly became more about shaming than correction. Those trapped in the stocks endured far more than discomfort. They were immobilized, unable to fend off insults, rotten food, mud, and even excrement hurled by angry townsfolk. The public was encouraged to participate, turning punishment into a community event. Children mocked and threw stones, neighbors ridiculed, and merchants passed by pretending to haggle over your worth. The humiliation didn't end when the offender was released. In small villages, reputations lasted a lifetime. A stint in the stocks branded you socially long after the bruises faded. For some, this punishment meant not just physical pain, but permanent exclusion from the community. The real cruelty of the stocks wasn't the wood or the restraint, it was the crowd. The offender was placed on display not as a lesson in justice, but as an object of entertainment. In this way, the stocks remind us that humiliation, when given the right stage, can be far more enduring than chains or whips. Number 14. Scarlet letter branding. The Scarlet Letter is now most famous from Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1850 novel, but its roots are found in real Puritan punishments. In 17th century New England and Old England alike, offenders of moral crimes, especially adultery, were sometimes forced to wear large letters sewn onto their clothing or even branded permanently into their skin. The letter A stood for adultery, but it wasn't the only mark of shame. Thieves might wear a T, drunkards a D, and blasphemers a B. The color of the patch carried symbolic weight. Red for sexual sin, black for corruption, yellow for betrayal. Some offenders were forced to carry placards or wear hats with their crimes spelled out. What made this punishment devastating was its permanence. Unlike the stocks, where humiliation ended with your release, the Scarlet Letter followed you everywhere. You could not hide it, nor could you explain it away. Each trip to market, each visit to church, each journey into another town reminded both you and others of your disgrace. For women especially, this punishment was a social death sentence. In tightly knit Puritan communities obsessed with moral purity, a Scarlet Letter meant exclusion, gossip, and rejection. Some never recovered their social standing. The Scarlet Letter is a chilling reminder that sometimes the harshest prisons are invisible, stitched into fabric, branded into skin, and burned into memory. Number 13. Cucking, stool, and ducking. The cucking stool was a wooden chair fixed to a beam or cart, used across medieval England and colonial America to punish those accused of gossiping, nagging, prostitution, or witchcraft. Victims, most often women, were strapped in and paraded through town, jeered at by onlookers. Sometimes humiliation was the end of it, but in harsher cases the chair was fixed to a long beam and dunked repeatedly into a pond or river. This ducking was supposed to be symbolic, cleansing the offender of their sins, but in practice it was dangerous and cruel. Being plunged into freezing water over and over while tightly bound could cause hypothermia, shock, or drowning. And all the while, crowds treated the event as a form of theater, shouting insults and laughing at the victim's misery. One of the darkest ironies of this punishment was its selective use. It was applied most often to women accused of disturbing the peace through gossip or scolding. In a time when women had little power, the cucking stool became a weapon of patriarchal control, silencing voices through humiliation. Some towns even kept their cucking stools as public monuments, proudly displaying the instruments of disgrace long after they were used. What began as a so-called moral correction ended as a grim spectacle of public cruelty. Number 12. Public caning in Singapore. Unlike most punishments on this list, public caning is not just history, it is still practiced in Singapore today. Administered with a thick, flexible rattan cane, this punishment is designed to leave lasting physical and psychological scars. Although the act itself is carried out inside prison grounds, its publicity makes it humiliating. Offenders, often young men, are sentenced in open court, and international attention has made certain cases infamous. The most famous was in 1994, when American teenager Michael Fay was sentenced to caning for vandalism. His punishment sparked international outrage, but Singapore stood firm, defending it as an effective deterrent. Caning is no slap on the wrist. The offender is bent over a frame, buttocks exposed, while an officer trained for the task delivers up to 24 strokes. Each lash can tear skin, draw blood, and leave scars that last for life. The sentence is reported in the media, ensuring that shame extends far beyond the prison walls. The pain is undeniable, but the humiliation is just as severe. The offender becomes a cautionary tale, remembered by name long after the wounds heal. In a modern world where justice is often hidden behind closed doors, Singapore's caning stands out as a very public reminder that shame remains a weapon of punishment. Number 11. Tarring and feathering. Few punishments combine humiliation and cruelty as effectively as tarring and feathering. Beginning in medieval Europe and later notorious in colonial America, the ritual was carried out by mobs rather than courts. The offender, accused of theft, treason, or moral crimes, was seized, stripped, and doused with hot tar. Feathers were then thrown over the sticky mess, transforming the victim into a grotesque spectacle. The punishment was theatrical. Victims were paraded through towns on carts or forced to march barefoot, attracting jeers and laughter. The humiliation was total, covered in feathers, sticky with tar, and powerless against the mob. Contrary to myth, the tar was not always boiling. Pine tar was heated only enough to spread easily. But the burns were real, and the tar hardened into a shell that ripped away skin and hair when removed. Recovery was long and agonizing. In America, the punishment took on political meaning. During the 18th century, loyalists accused of supporting the British crown were tarred and feathered by revolutionaries as both warning and entertainment. For the victim, the punishment was unforgettable. It wasn't just the burns or the pain, it was the knowledge that the entire community had conspired to make you into a walking joke, a living lesson in disgrace. Number 10. The drunkard's cloak. The drunkard's cloak was one of the most humiliating punishments in early modern Europe. First recorded in the 16th and 17th century England, it spread across the continent and even into Russia, where it was called the shame barrel. The device was simple, a large barrel with holes cut for the arms and head. Once inside, the offender could barely move, the heavy wood dragging on their body with every step. Habitual drunkards, thieves, or beggars were forced into the cloak and paraded through the streets. The crowd's laughter and insults turned the punishment into pure spectacle. Children pointed, shopkeepers mocked, and the offender became a stumbling, ridiculous figure. It was a punishment designed less to hurt the body and more to crush the spirit. In some towns, offenders were left to wander for hours, unable to sit, eat, or relieve themselves without assistance. The humiliation was total. You were both trapped inside the barrel and trapped inside the eyes of your community. The drunkard's cloak is remembered today as a comic image, but for its victims it was anything but funny. It was a moving prison of shame, and one that left its mark long after the barrel was lifted away. Number 9. Whipping post spectacle. The whipping post stood as one of the most notorious instruments of humiliation, often placed at the very heart of towns. Offenders guilty of theft, fraud, or public disorder were tied to the post and flogged in front of eager crowds. The punishment was deliberately public. Marketplaces and churchyards were chosen for maximum visibility. Sometimes the number of lashes was proclaimed in advance, building anticipation like a grim show. The crack of the whip echoed through the square, each strike a signal to gasp, laugh, or jeer. Though painful, the real punishment lay in the humiliation. To be seen stripped, tied, and whipped before friends and neighbors reduced a person to an object of ridicule. In some communities, the whipping post itself became infamous, a symbol of shame that people avoided even walking past. Remarkably, whipping persisted into the modern age. Delaware kept its whipping post until the 1950s, making it one of the last American states to abandon the practice. For centuries, it served as a reminder that justice wasn't always about fairness or rehabilitation. Sometimes it was about spectacle, with pain and humiliation broadcast for all to see. Number 8. Pillories. Though often confused with stocks, the pillory was distinct and arguably more humiliating. Instead of securing the ankles, the pillory clamped a person's head and hands in place, forcing them to stand upright, exposed and immobile. Victims were left in busy public squares, sometimes for hours or even days. Crowds gathered not just to watch, but to participate, throwing rotten food, mud, stones, or worse. The pillory forced direct eye contact, ensuring that humiliation was deeply personal. Every insult had to be absorbed, every laugh endured. While some sentences ended without lasting injury, others turned deadly. In London, for example, certain criminals died in the pillory after violent mobs pelted them with bricks and stones while guards looked away. For less violent cases, the psychological toll was immense. The memory of standing locked and ridiculed before an entire town could last a lifetime. The pillory was abolished in England in 1837, but for centuries it symbolized the darkest side of public punishment, a stage for cruelty disguised as justice. Number 7. Parading criminals through the streets. Public parades of criminals are as old as civilization itself. In ancient Rome, defeated enemies were marched in chains behind triumphant generals, paraded through cheering crowds before their execution. In medieval Europe, thieves and adulterers were led through towns wearing signs declaring their crimes. The humiliation was calculated. Criminals might be stripped to their underclothes, forced to wear ridiculous costumes, or burdened with heavy chains. In some cultures, drums or bells announced their approach, drawing neighbors and strangers to line the streets. In 20th century China, this practice resurfaced during the Cultural Revolution, where struggle sessions forced supposed traitors and intellectuals to march through towns with placards around their necks, their crimes shouted through megaphones. The effect was devastating. A parade wasn't just a punishment. It was a ritual of social destruction. The community became complicit, turning justice into theater and ensuring the offender's reputation would never recover. Few punishments have been so effective at blending fear, shame, and entertainment into one public spectacle. Number 6. Shaming via public notice boards. Not all humiliating punishments required chains or whips. Sometimes it was enough to expose someone's name for all to see. In medieval Europe, towns posted lists of offenders on public boards, announcing crimes and sentences. In Japan, kosatsu boards displayed laws and criminals' names in busy areas, ensuring no one could claim ignorance or avoid shame. This tradition survives in modern times. In some communities, drunk drivers' names are still published in local newspapers. Governments release lists of tax evaders or corrupt officials online where the digital record is permanent. Even cyber-shaming campaigns where mugshots are published on police websites carry echoes of these old practices. While there is no physical pain in such punishments, the humiliation can be worse. A person's reputation is shattered instantly, and in the internet age, the shame can follow them globally and indefinitely. The notice board proves that public humiliation doesn't always need a stage or a crowd. Sometimes all it takes is ink on a page or pixels on a screen to ruin a name forever. Number 5. Wooden neck yokes, cangues. In China, until well into the 20th century, offenders were often sentenced to wear a heavy wooden board around their neck called a cangue. Unlike simple shackles, this yoke could weigh over 50 pounds and extend wide enough to prevent the wearer from feeding themselves or even lying down comfortably. The cangue was not just a restraint, but a stage for humiliation. Offenders were forced to stand or walk in crowded areas, the crime often written directly on the wood for everyone to read. Marketplaces and village squares became theaters of disgrace, where people would jeer, spit, or demand apologies. The physical toll was immense. The weight strained shoulders and necks, caused blisters, and sometimes left permanent injuries. Offenders were dependent on others to eat or drink, a further humiliation that reduced them to helplessness. The cangue's symbolism was powerful. You carried your crime literally on your shoulders. It was a punishment that blended physical suffering with the crushing burden of public shame. Even after the cangue was removed, the memory of being seen stumbling under its weight lingered long after. Number 4. Dunce caps. In European schools during the 18th and 19th centuries, children who misbehaved or performed poorly were singled out by being forced to wear the infamous dunce cap, a tall, pointed paper hat often inscribed with the word dunce, or mocking phrases. The child was then made to sit in a corner or stand before the class while peers laughed. Though the punishment seems trivial compared to whips or stocks, its cruelty lay in its psychological effect. Education was supposed to be a path to respectability, and being branded as a fool before your classmates could permanently damage a child's confidence. Some schools escalated the humiliation further, forcing children to wear placards hung around their necks, declaring idler or liar. The practice was less about correcting mistakes and more about stamping shame into the very foundation of a child's identity. By the 20th century, the dunce cap had fallen out of favor, condemned as cruel and counterproductive. Yet the symbol of the pointed hat remains etched in popular memory, a reminder that humiliation doesn't always need chains or pain. Sometimes all it takes is ridicule to wound the deepest. We are now moving on to the top 3 of the list. If you have made it this far, please do not forget to like this video and subscribe to Vault of 15. Number 3. The paper hat of shame. In Imperial China, some offenders were forced to wear elaborately crafted paper hats announcing their crimes. These hats were often oversized, brightly painted, and inscribed with the offense in bold characters. To increase ridicule, they were sometimes decorated with bells or tassels, making escape from attention impossible. The punishment rarely ended with the hat alone. Offenders were paraded through crowded streets, kneeling in public squares, or dragged along by guards while crowds laughed and jeered. Combined with placards worn around the neck, the hat turned a person into a living billboard of disgrace. Though made of fragile material, the paper hat carried immense symbolic weight. Unlike prison or corporal punishment, it attacked dignity directly, leaving no physical scar but ensuring reputational ruin. For many, the shame of being forced into such a spectacle was worse than a beating. This theatrical ritual of humiliation shows how justice often became performance, turning human suffering into public entertainment and shame into a tool of control. Number two, shaving the head. Shaving as punishment has been practiced across cultures for centuries, used to strip dignity and mark someone for social exclusion. Monks expelled from monasteries had their tonsures reversed. Thieves and deserters in armies were shaved bald. And in many societies, women accused of moral crimes faced this brutal humiliation. Perhaps the most infamous example occurred in post-World War II France. Women accused of collaborating with German occupiers, often through relationships, were dragged into public squares and had their heads forcibly shaved before jeering crowds. Some were paraded through towns, marked as traitors for all to see. The cruelty of this punishment lay in its lasting effect. Hair takes months to grow back, during which time the victim remained visibly branded. Every outing, every glance, every whisper reinforced the stigma. Shaving was simple, but devastating. It turned personal identity into a symbol of disgrace, a mark that couldn't be hidden, and a memory that could haunt for life. Number one, public execution as spectacle. The ultimate act of humiliation came not just from death, but from making death itself entertainment. For centuries, executions were carried out in public squares before massive crowds. From medieval hangings to the guillotine of revolutionary France, the condemned were paraded, mocked, and displayed before their final moments. Vendors sold food and drinks at these gruesome gatherings. Children sat on shoulders, watching as if it were theater. Every stumble on the scaffold, every trembling word became part of the spectacle. In some cases, executioners deliberately dragged out the ordeal, turning punishment into a grotesque performance. In England, Tyburn executions drew crowds of tens of thousands. In France, the guillotine was used in public until 1939, with the event covered in newspapers as though it were sport. The humiliation wasn't only for the condemned. Families were shamed, reputations destroyed, and entire legacies tainted. Death ended the suffering, but the memory of dying as a public show ensured humiliation lived on long after the body was gone. We hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching. Throughout history, punishments weren't always about justice. Often they were designed to break pride, to turn human suffering into a show. Follow us for more lists that uncover the strange, the cruel, and the unbelievable. And remember, truth is in the list.